He stopped in the doorway, frozen. The cleaner twirling his son in a beam of golden light, laughter echoing through halls that hadn't heard joy in years. And in that moment, everything shifted. The halls of the Whitmore estate were polished to perfection, the kind of gleaming marble that reflected not only the light, but also the loneliness. Every footstep seemed to echo back, as though the house itself was whispering, "You're alone." Ethan Whitmore, 45, immaculately dressed, jaw perpetually tight, strode through his home as though it were a boardroom. Even at home he wore the same crisp navy suit, the same polished black shoes, the same expression that kept people from getting too close. It was easier that way. Distance was control and control was safety. But control also meant his son, Daniel, spent most of his days behind closed doors. At 12, Daniel's world was limited to the East Wing, a private school tutor, physical therapy sessions, and the occasional supervised outing. Born with cerebral palsy, Daniel moved with the aid of crutches, his gait careful and deliberate, each step a small victory. Ethan told himself it was protection. The truth? He didn't know how to face the boy without also facing the memory of his late wife, whose laughter once filled these same marble halls. Across town, in a cramped apartment with peeling wallpaper, Clara Morgan folded her cleaning uniform neatly into her bag. She had been working for the Whitmore family for only a month. It was the kind of job she couldn't afford to lose, not with her mother's medical bills piling up and her little sister's college tuition looming like an unpaid debt. Clara wasn't just a cleaner, she was a listener, a noticer. She caught the small details, the way Daniel's eyes lit up when music drifted in from the garden speakers, or how the boy's shoulders relaxed when someone crouched to speak to him at eye level. She also noticed the other thing. Ethan never stayed in the same room with his son for more than 5 minutes. Her first week in the house, she'd asked Daniel if he liked dancing. He had looked at her like no one had ever asked before. "I can't dance," he'd said. She'd smiled and answered, "Then you haven't tried with the right partner." Ethan's days began before sunrise, business calls with Tokyo, a conference briefing, and emails stacked like bricks. The staff knew better than to interrupt him unless something was on fire, metaphorically or literally. That morning, his assistant had reminded him, "Daniel's therapy session at 3. You promised to be there." He'd nodded without meaning it. Promises were easier to make than keep. Still, something, maybe guilt, maybe restlessness, made him wrap up early that day. His footsteps echoed across the long corridor toward the East Wing, past tall windows spilling afternoon sunlight onto the marble floor. And that's when he heard it. Music. Not the muffled background kind. This was loud, joyful, unapologetic. Clara had found an old Bluetooth speaker in the storage room. She wasn't sure who it belonged to, but she figured music could make dusting less miserable. Daniel had been watching her from the doorway, his crutches supporting him like twin sentinels. "What is that?" he asked, pointing to the speaker. "Magic," she said, grinning. "Want to see?" She played a song, something with rhythm you could feel in your bones. Daniel laughed, a real laugh, not the polite chuckles adults gave him. She held out her hand. "I told you," he protested. "I can't dance." "Good," she replied, "because I can't either. Now we're even." They began awkwardly. She moved slowly, matching her steps to his uneven ones, letting him lead when he wanted. He swayed, shifted, found a rhythm that made his eyes brighter than the sunlight spilling through the tall windows. For a few minutes it wasn't about his legs or her paycheck, it was about joy. Ethan reached the open door to Daniel's playroom and stopped cold. There was Clara, spinning with his son in the warm flood of sunlight, Daniel's laughter filling the air like it belonged there. Something twisted inside Ethan's chest. He hadn't heard that sound in years. Daniel didn't notice him. Clara did. Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of guilt passing over her face, not because she was doing anything wrong, but because she had been caught in a moment too intimate for her position. Ethan cleared his throat, his voice measured. "What's going on here?" Daniel froze, his smile faltering. Clara gently lowered her hands, stepping back but not apologizing. "Just dancing," she said softly, her gaze steady. "If you were Ethan, would you see this moment as overstepping, or as something your son desperately needed? Tell me in the comments. Is joy worth breaking the rules for?" Ethan didn't answer Clara's comment. He simply looked at his son, really looked, for the first time in weeks. Then he turned and walked away, but not before glancing back once as though something in that golden-lit room had followed him. The stage was set. He'd pretend it meant nothing. She'd pretend she wasn't shaken. But both knew something had shifted in the air. The sound of laughter lingered long after Ethan left the doorway. It clung to him, unwelcome yet magnetic, as he walked down the hall. He told himself it was inappropriate. A cleaner shouldn't be engaging his son like that without permission. But another voice whispered, "Then why did it feel man's right?" He poured himself a glass of scotch at 3 in the afternoon, a habit he reserved for moments when the silence in his chest felt too loud. He sipped, replaying the image. Daniel's face tilted upward, pure joy on display. Clara's eyes fixed on him with a warmth Ethan couldn't remember anyone giving him in years. In the playroom, Clara crouched to pick up the speaker, pressing pause. The silence after music always felt heavier, as if the air remembered the rhythm and mourned its loss. Daniel frowned. "Did I get you in trouble?" She shook her head, but the truth was, she wasn't sure. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "people don't understand things until they've had time to think about them." He looked at the floor. "Dad never dances." Clara smiled faintly. Maybe he forgot how. That evening, Ethan appeared in the kitchen. Staff usually cleared out when he entered, but Clara was scrubbing the sink, her back to him. "You were with Daniel today," he said. It wasn't a question. She turned, her expression calm but guarded. "I was cleaning the playroom. He liked the music." "You danced." She hesitated. He smiled. The two sentences hung in the air, heavier than they seemed. Ethan leaned against the counter, watching her. "I don't pay you to entertain my son." "No," she replied evenly. "You pay me to clean your house, but sometimes the people in it need more than that." Her tone wasn't defiant, but it wasn't apologetic either. It unnerved him. Over the next few days, Ethan noticed things he'd never bothered to before. Daniel's laughter would drift down the hall when Clara was nearby. There was more light in the boy's eyes, more willingness to try things in therapy. At first, Ethan kept his distance, but during a lunch break, he found himself standing outside the playroom again, unseen, listening to Clara describe the colors of autumn leaves to Daniel, as if each leaf had a story. That night, Ethan sat at his desk, laptop open but untouched. His gaze drifted to a framed photograph on the bookshelf. His late wife, Anna, holding Daniel as a baby. Anna had been the one who sang to Daniel, who filled their home with warmth. Since she'd passed, Ethan had replaced warmth with order, music with silence. Is that what I've done? He wondered. Protected him or imprisoned him? The memory of Clara's voice, soft yet certain, replayed in his head. Sometimes the people in it need more than that. 2 mornings later, during breakfast, Daniel looked at his father and said, "Can Clara come to the park with us?" Ethan nearly choked on his coffee. "What park?" "You said we could go when the weather got nicer." "Well, it's nice now, and I want her to come." Ethan tried to deflect. "She's busy." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "You're always busy too." The words stung more than Ethan expected. He set his cup down slowly, the silence between them almost tangible. By Saturday, Ethan found himself doing something he couldn't explain, inviting Clara to join them. He told himself it was because Daniel insisted. But as they walked through the park, Clara walking beside Daniel while he navigated the paths with his crutches, Ethan noticed the ease between them. Daniel laughed at something she said, and without meaning to, Ethan smiled too. Not the tight-lipped, polite smile he wore in business meetings, but something looser, almost forgotten. On their way back, a little girl in the park tripped and fell. Clara was the first to kneel, brushing dirt off the girl's knees and reassuring her before her mother arrived. Daniel watched her intently, his voice quiet when he said, "She's like Mom." Ethan's steps faltered. Clara didn't hear him, but Ethan did. and the words lodged deep. That night, Ethan poured himself another scotch but didn't drink it. Instead, he walked to Daniel's room, pausing in the doorway. Clara was helping Daniel into bed, tucking the blanket carefully around him. Ethan didn't interrupt, but the sight stayed with him. Something in him, something rusted shut for years, had started to move. Do you believe a single moment, like hearing a laugh you thought you'd lost, can change the course of someone's life? Comment below if you've ever experienced a spark that changed everything. Ethan lay awake that night staring at the ceiling. He had thought the cleaner's presence was incidental, a footnote in their lives. But now it felt like the first page of a story he wasn't sure he knew how to write. The following week, the mansion felt different. The music and laughter that had briefly animated the halls were gone. Ethan had given an unspoken order, not in words, but in the way he avoided eye contact and disappeared into his study when Clara was around. Clara noticed. She always noticed. Daniel noticed too. He became quieter, his smile rarer. The boy wasn't naive. He could sense when invisible walls were being rebuilt. Ethan told himself it was for the best. He had been too lenient. Lines needed to be redrawn before blurred roles created problems. His world worked because of structure. Staff did their jobs, family stayed protected, emotions stayed contained. And yet, during a business meeting, as a client droned on about quarterly projections, Ethan found his mind drifting to the park, Daniel's laugh, Clara's hand steadying him. It wasn't weakness, he told himself, just distraction. Still, he didn't like the way it felt. On Wednesday, Clara entered the playroom carrying fresh laundry. Daniel's face lit up. "We can dance again," he whispered eagerly, glancing at the speaker in the corner. Before she could answer, Ethan appeared in the doorway. "Daniel, you have your therapy session now," he said, his tone clipped. "It's not until 4, Daniel replied. "I moved it up," Ethan said, eyes not leaving Clara's. She understood the message. Not now, not like before. She gave Daniel a small smile and quietly left the room. In the laundry room, Clara shoved towels into the dryer harder than necessary. She wasn't angry at Daniel, never. But Ethan's behavior scraped against something inside her. She'd seen this before. Wealthy families who treated care like a transaction, affection like a risk. Still, she needed the job, and jobs like this didn't tolerate defiance. So she told herself to keep her head down and just clean. That evening, Daniel refused dinner. The housekeeper tried coaxing him, but the boy crossed his arms. When Ethan came to his room, Daniel didn't look at him. "You're upset," Ethan observed. Daniel's voice was small but steady. "You took her away." "I didn't." Ethan started, then stopped, because maybe in a way he had. "She makes things better," Daniel said simply. "And you don't." The words hit Ethan like a punch. He left the room without replying, but they followed him all the way back to his study. The next day, Ethan approached Clara in the hallway. "I don't want Daniel getting attached," he said. Her hands tightened on the mop handle. "Why? Because you might have to care too." Ethan stiffened. "You're out of line." "Maybe," she said, "but so are you if you think keeping him at arm's length is love." The silence between them was sharp. Then Clara stepped aside, letting him pass, her chin lifted in quiet defiance. Small changes began to show. Daniel's therapist mentioned he seemed less motivated. Meals went untouched more often. Even the staff, who usually avoided gossip, exchanged glances when Ethan entered the room. One rainy afternoon, Ethan stood at his office window watching the storm. The house felt cold again, the way it had before Clara came, and for the first time, he wondered if he had made a mistake. On Friday, Clara received an envelope in the mailroom, a past-due notice from her mother's hospital. The number was more than she made in 2 months. She folded it carefully, tucking it into her pocket. She wasn't sure why, but she thought of Ethan, not as a potential savior, but as someone who might understand what it meant to carry a weight alone. Then she shook her head. No. Men like him didn't understand. They judged. That evening, as Clara was leaving, Ethan passed her in the foyer. For a brief moment it seemed like he might say something and maybe even apologize. His hand twitched slightly as if to stop her, but then he straightened, his voice businesslike. "See you Monday." She nodded once and walked out, the click of the door sounding far louder than it should. When pride and fear clash with what the heart wants, which should win? Have you ever held back from someone because you were afraid to care? Share your thoughts in the comments. Ethan sat alone in his study that night, the silence pressing in again. Upstairs, Daniel stared at the ceiling, replaying the sound of music that had once filled his room, and Clara, in her small apartment, closed her eyes and told herself she'd forget both of them, but none of them really believed it. The storm rolled in on a Tuesday afternoon, dark clouds swallowing the sunlight. By evening, rain hammered against the Whitmore estate's tall windows, and the wind howled like it wanted in. The power went out at 7:14 p.m., the kind of blackout that silences even the hum of the refrigerator. Within minutes, the staff began heading home. Roads were still passable, but the storm was worsening and Ethan told them to leave while they could. Everyone except Clara. Her car wouldn't start. Ethan stood in the foyer, watching her fumble with her phone by the door. "You won't get a tow truck out here tonight," he said finally. "I'll manage," she replied, slipping her phone into her bag. "You'll manage to get stuck halfway down the driveway in a storm." She looked up at him, chin tilted. "I've been through worse." Something in her tone made him pause. "Stay in the guest wing," he said. "Just for tonight." She hesitated, then nodded once. "Fine. But I'm not staying because you're worried about me." "Of course not," he said dryly. "It's Daniel I'm worried about. He needs his cleaner." Neither of them believed it, but neither called the other out. Without power, the mansion felt strangely smaller. Candlelight threw warm flickers across the marble floors. Clara helped Daniel into the lounge, where they sat near the fireplace Ethan had reluctantly lit. For a while, no one spoke. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the rain rattling the windows. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "Dad, tell Clara the story about the tree house." Ethan glanced at him. "What tree house?" "The one Mom said you built when you were 16. Ethan's gaze shifted to Clara, who was watching him quietly. "It wasn't much of a tree house," he said after a pause. "More like a box in a tree." Daniel grinned. "Tell it." So Ethan did, haltingly at first, then with more detail. As he spoke, Clara noticed the way his voice softened when he mentioned Anna, and how his eyes kept flicking to Daniel, as if measuring how much to share. Later, Clara slipped into the darkened kitchen to make tea. She was lighting the gas stove when she heard footsteps behind her. "Need help?" Ethan asked. "I'm fine." He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching her work. "You handle storms well." "I've been through them," she said simply, literal and otherwise. Something about that answer tugged at him, but he didn't push. Instead, he said, "Daniel's happy when you're around." Clara glanced at him. "Then why did you try to keep me away?" He didn't answer right away. The flame under the kettle hissed softly, "Because I don't know how to need people without losing them." The admission surprised them both. Clara didn't reply, but her eyes softened, just for a moment. When the storm knocked loose a branch that thudded against the roof, Ethan went to check it. Clara followed, holding a flashlight. They worked together in the attic, moving an old trunk to keep the leak from dripping onto the carpet. In the dim beam of the flashlight, their hands brushed, and both of them froze for half a second longer than necessary. Ethan cleared his throat. "Thanks for the help." Clara smirked faintly. "Guess I'm more than just a cleaner tonight." Back in the lounge, Daniel had fallen asleep on the couch, the firelight making his face look peaceful. Ethan and Clara sat in separate chairs, neither speaking. The rain softened to a steady patter. Finally, Clara said quietly, "He's a good kid. You should let him see more of the world." Ethan stared into the fire. "The world isn't kind." "It can be," she countered, "if you let it." The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was the kind that came when both people were thinking about the same thing, but didn't know how to say it. Later, as Ethan walked Clara to the guest room, They paused at the door. "Good night," he said. "Good night." For a second it felt like something else hovered on the edge. Gratitude, apology, maybe even curiosity, but neither crossed the line. In the stillness of the guest room, Clara listened to the storm fade and wondered why the walls between them felt thinner tonight. In his own room, Ethan lay awake, the image of her by the fire lingering like a light he couldn't put out. The morning after the storm, sunlight poured into the mansion, golden and fresh, as if it had been holding its breath all night. Clara brewed coffee in the kitchen before the staff returned. She had almost convinced herself that the closeness of last night had been a fluke, until Ethan walked in. He wasn't in a suit, just a plain grey sweater and dark jeans, no tie, no polished shoes. Somehow that unsettled her more than his formality. "Morning," he said, voice low, almost normal. "Morning," she replied, setting a mug on the counter for him. They drank in silence for a moment, the clink of spoons and the faint hum of the fridge filling the space. Daniel wheeled into the kitchen, still in pajamas, and looked at his father. "Are you staying home today?" "I am," Ethan said. Daniel's eyes lit up. "Can we go through the attic? You said we'd do it one day." Clara glanced at Ethan, surprised. He hesitated. "All right." Dust motes danced in the sunlight as they pushed open the attic door. Boxes stacked high, old furniture draped in sheets, and the faint scent of cedar filled the air. Daniel made it a mission, pointing to boxes, asking what was inside. One box, when opened, spilled photographs onto the floor. Clara crouched, picking one up. A young Ethan, in a tuxedo, smiling with a woman whose eyes seemed to sparkle even in a faded print. "Your mum," Clara guessed softly. Ethan nodded. "Anna." Daniel's voice was quiet. "Tell her story." Ethan sat on an old trunk, the sunlight catching in his hair. "She was the opposite of me. Bright, brave. She danced in the rain and didn't care who saw. She made this house feel alive." He paused, his gaze distant. "After Daniel was born, she got sick, cancer. We thought we had more time." Clara listened, her heart heavy. She didn't press him, but she didn't look away either. "When she died," Ethan said, "I thought keeping the world out would keep the pain out too, but all it did was keep everything out." Daniel reached for another box, this one marked with unfamiliar handwriting. Inside were old school books, a small stuffed rabbit, and a faded hospital bracelet. Clara froze when she saw it. "That's yours?" Ethan asked. She nodded slowly. "I grew up taking care of my little sister. Mom wasn't around much. Dad left early. I was 13 when I got sick. Pneumonia. No one came to the hospital. I remember watching the door, thinking maybe someone would." She gave a small, sad smile. "No one did. After that, I learned not to expect people to stay." Ethan said nothing, but something in his face softened. Not pity, but recognition. They worked side by side for the next hour, sorting and boxing. Every so often their eyes would meet, as if silently acknowledging the weight of what had been shared. Daniel, sensing the shift, grinned to himself. He didn't know what exactly had changed, but he could feel it. The air between them was warmer. As Clara passed Ethan in the hallway, he stopped her. "Thank you for telling me." She tilted her head. "You told me first." It wasn't much, but in a house where walls had been built over years, it felt like laying the first brick of something else entirely. That night, Ethan sat in his study, the photograph of Anna now on his desk. Across town, Clara unfolded the hospital notice from her pocket again, but this time she didn't feel quite so alone carrying it. 2 days after the attic, the house felt different. It wasn't loud or obvious. The change was in the small things. Ethan passing Clara in the hall without tightening his jaw, Clara letting her gaze linger a second longer when he spoke, Daniel watching them like a secret he was keeping for himself. Clara was in the kitchen making herself a sandwich when Ethan walked in. "You eat here?" he asked, a hint of surprise in his tone. "Usually in the laundry room," she replied. Less chance of bumping into anyone who thinks I don't belong." Ethan frowned slightly, then pulled out a chair. "Sit. Eat here." She hesitated, but eventually sat. He poured water for both of them. They ate in quiet at first, but Daniel wandered in halfway through, climbing into the chair between them. Clara told a story about her little sister trying to bake cookies and accidentally using salt instead of sugar. Daniel laughed so hard his crutches almost tipped. Ethan found himself laughing too, quietly but genuinely. That afternoon, Daniel asked to go into the garden. Clara pushed his chair along the gravel path, while Ethan followed behind. They stopped under the big oak tree, sunlight dappling the grass. Clara picked up a handful of fallen leaves, tossing them into the air. Daniel reached up, laughing as they fluttered down around him. Ethan stood back, watching. For a moment, he wasn't a businessman, a widower, or a man with a fortress for a heart. He was just a father watching his son's joy he hadn't seen in years. Clara caught him watching and smiled, not the polite smile of an employee, a real one. That evening, while dusting the music room, Clara ran her fingers over the grand piano keys. A soft note rang out. "You play?" Ethan's voice came from the doorway. "A little," she admitted. "My mum taught me before things got complicated." He walked in, sitting on the bench beside her. Anna used to play. Daniel never wanted lessons, but he loved listening. Clara played a simple melody, hesitant at first, then smoother. Ethan closed his eyes, just listening. When she stopped, he said quietly, "The house hasn't sounded like that in a long time." Over the next week, small things began to happen without discussion. Ethan asked Clara to join them for breakfast. Clara left a book in Daniel's room that she thought he'd like. Ethan fixed the loose button on Clara's coat without saying a word about it. None of it was big enough to name, but all of it was big enough to notice. One night, as Clara tucked Daniel in, he whispered, "You make Dad different." "How?" she asked. "Like when the sun comes through the window after it rains." Her throat tightened. "Go to sleep, poet." But later, she found herself standing in the hallway, replaying his words. On Friday, after Daniel had gone to bed, Clara walked past the study and saw Ethan sitting at his desk, not working, just staring at the photograph of Anna. She tapped the doorframe. "Long day." He nodded. "Better with the right company." For a moment, neither moved. It wasn't romantic yet, but it was something. The quiet kind of connection that grows when people start seeing each other instead of just looking. That night, Clara lay in bed thinking about the strange, careful warmth blooming between them. And Ethan, in his study, found himself wondering when the sound of her voice had become something he looked forward to. It happened on a Thursday. Clara had just finished folding laundry when she heard voices in the study, Ethan's and one she didn't recognize. She wasn't eavesdropping, but the door was slightly open, and the tone in Ethan's voice was sharp. "She's overstepping," a man said. Ethan replied, "I've noticed." The words hit her like a cold slap. "She's getting too close to the boy," the man continued. "You hire help to clean, not to play house." "She's good with him," Ethan said, but his tone wasn't defending. It was cautious. "Exactly. Too good. You know what people will say, that she's trying to get something out of you." Clara didn't stay to hear the rest. She turned, her hands trembling, as she made her way to the laundry room. That evening, Ethan found Clara in the kitchen. "We need to talk," he began. She didn't let him finish. "Don't bother. I already heard you." "Heard what?" "That I'm overstepping. That I'm too close. That maybe I'm here for something other than my job." His jaw tightened. "You shouldn't have been listening." She laughed bitterly. "I wasn't listening. I was walking by. But I guess the truth doesn't care how it's delivered. It's not that simple. It is. You don't trust me. You never have." The kitchen seemed to shrink around them. Daniel came in halfway through, confusion on his face. "What's going on?" "Nothing," Ethan said quickly. Clara shook her head. "Everything." She crouched to meet Daniel's eyes. "You're a wonderful boy, Daniel. Don't ever think otherwise." Then she stood, grabbed her bag, and walked out. Ethan didn't stop her. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how. Pride was a hard habit to break, and right now, pride was louder than the ache in his chest. He poured a drink, but didn't touch it. The study felt colder. The whole house did. At home, Clara slammed her bag onto the couch and sat in the dark. She told herself it was better this way. Less complicated, less dangerous. But the sound of Daniel's disappointed eyes and the image of Ethan not stopping her made her feel hollow. The next day, Daniel refused to speak to Ethan. He wouldn't eat breakfast. He wouldn't look at him. When Ethan finally said, "She's not coming back," Daniel replied, "Then neither am I." Ethan froze. "What do you mean?" "I mean I won't talk to you until she's here again." That night, the mansion was silent again. Not the peaceful kind, but the suffocating kind. Ethan sat in the dark, the memory of Clara laughing with Daniel looping in his head, wondering when exactly he had started needing her. The rain had returned. Clara sat at her small kitchen table, a mug of tea growing cold in her hands. She hadn't been back to the mansion in 4 days, and though she told herself she'd moved on, her chest betrayed her every time she thought of Daniel's face. Her phone buzzed once, a number she recognized but didn't answer. Ethan hadn't called, not once. She told herself she wasn't surprised. She opened the hospital notice from her mother's care again, the weight of the debt pressing like a stone on her ribs. "You can survive this alone," she told herself. "You always have." But for the first time, she hated the word alone. Across town, Ethan sat in his study, papers spread out but untouched. Daniel hadn't said more than 2 words to him since Clara left. He'd tried logic, bribery, even promising a trip to the seaside. Nothing worked. Finally, Daniel said simply, "I don't want things if she's not here." That sentence gnawed at him long into the night. On the 5th day, Ethan did something he hadn't done in years. He wrote a letter. Not an email, not a text. A letter. It was short. He didn't apologize outright. He didn't know how. But he wrote, "I was wrong to doubt you. Daniel misses you. I do too." He sealed it in an envelope, sat with it for an hour, then drove it to her building himself. Clara found the letter on her doormat that evening. She read it twice, her fingers tracing the indentation of his handwriting as though the words were carved into her. Her first instinct was to throw it away, to protect herself. But Daniel's laugh echoed in her mind, and she realized this wasn't just about her or Ethan. It was about the boy who had trusted her. She picked up her phone and dialed. Ethan answered on the first ring. "Clara," he said, her name sounding like both a question and an answer. "I'm not coming back for you," she said evenly. "I'm coming back for Daniel. If you can accept that, I'll see you tomorrow." There was a pause. Then, "I can accept that." Clara hung up, her heart pounding. Ethan stayed on the line a moment longer after the call ended, staring at the phone like it had just pulled him back from the edge of something permanent. Tomorrow would change everything, one way or another. When Clara arrived the next morning, the mansion didn't feel cold. The staff glanced up in quiet surprise as she walked through the foyer, her steps steady, her head high. Daniel's voice rang out from the top of the stairs. "Clara!" He clattered down on his crutches faster than was safe. She met him halfway, kneeling so he could wrap his arms around her neck. "You came back," he said into her shoulder. "Told you I would," she murmured, holding him tight. Ethan appeared in the doorway of the lounge. He didn't speak at first, just watched. The tension that had sat on his face for days was gone, replaced with something quiet, almost uncertain. When their eyes met, Clara gave a small nod. Not forgiveness yet, but permission to start over. "Tea?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Sure." That afternoon, Daniel asked for music. Clara hesitated, glancing at Ethan. This time, he crossed the room and picked up the speaker himself. "What song?" he asked Daniel. Daniel grinned. "The one Clara played before you got mad." Ethan's mouth twitched and almost a smile as the melody filled the room. Clara took Daniel's hands, guiding him into a slow, careful sway. Ethan stood by the window, watching. Then, without warning, he stepped forward. "Mind if I join?" he asked. Daniel beamed. "Only if you promise not to step on our feet." And just like that, the three of them moved together in the golden sunlight, the same light from that first day, but now warmer, fuller, earned. When the song ended, Daniel wheeled himself to the window to watch the garden. Clara started to step away, but Ethan caught her arm gently. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For giving him joy. For reminding me what it looks like. For not giving up on us." Her eyes softened. "Don't make me regret it." A week later, the three of them were in the park again. Clara walking beside Daniel, Ethan on the other side. There was no tension now, no roles to play. Just a boy, his father, and the woman who had taught them both how to let light back in. Ethan glanced at Clara, sunlight catching in her hair. "You were right," he said. "About what?" "The world can be kind, if you let it." Back at the mansion that evening, Daniel insisted on one last dance before bed. Ethan watched, smiling, as Clara twirled him slowly under the chandelier's glow. It wasn't the same as that first doorway moment. It was better, because this time Ethan wasn't frozen on the threshold. He stepped into the light. Some moments change everything in an instant. Others take time, trust, and the courage to try again. In the Whitmore mansion, it had taken both, and it had been worth every second.